Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the University of Melbourne. Let me begin, please, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and paying respect to elders past and present. My name is Glenn Davis. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. It is a great delight to welcome you tonight to the 2014 A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism. It's a particular delight to welcome two great supporters of the art and publishing and journalism in Anna and Morry Schwartz. Tonight, Morry will deliver one of the university's oldest continuous annual public lectures, the A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism, a lecture that has two important functions. The first, of course, is to commemorate a fine Australian journalist and influential press gallery reporter of the early 20th century, Mr. Arthur Norman Smith, and the second is to lead and contribute to the national debate about journalism. The state of our journalism is a theme of perennial public importance, and never more so than given the declining traditional media and the shift to online media of the past decade. This is a shift that continues to be felt this year, and I look forward to hearing the fresh perspective in tonight's A.N. Smith lecture by Morry Schwartz. But may I mention, for the benefit of anyone who's going to ask a question, that this is being filmed and will be broadcast by the university, so please keep that in mind as you speak. Now, Morry is someone who needs relatively little introduction to most of this audience, but some basic facts about his career. Born in Hungary, lived his first few years in Israel before the family migrated to Australia when he was 10. He briefly studied architecture here at the University of Melbourne, but decided the world had much more to offer, and he set out to travel. In his 20s, he set up a series of enterprises, including a film distribution business, a pioneering publishing work called Outback Press, the Aardvark concreting business, whose purpose was to support his publishing ambitions. And he's remained this extraordinary combination of publisher and property developer to this day, using one to support his passion and enthusiasm for the other. He has, of course, made possible the publication of so many fine books under the Black Ink imprint, under Nero Books, along with the important journal, The Quarterly Essay. His passion for journalism is reflected in the very successful 2005 launch of the monthly magazine and this year of the Saturday paper, both publications reaching a national audience. In a tribute to his stature in the world of news, this year Morry was appointed Adjunct Professor of Journalism at RMIT University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him back to the University of Melbourne tonight to speak on the topic, the net effect and Optimist in the news business. To deliver the 2014 A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism, please welcome Morry Schwartz.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Margaret. Good evening, everyone. I acknowledge Arthur Norman Smith, the founder of the AJA, and his family, who in 1938 established this lecture in his memory. I'm honoured to give this year's A.N. Smith Lecture. The newspaper is a beloved artefact of modern life. It is linked in our minds to the smell of morning coffee, of leisure on a Saturday, the familiar voices of favourite columnists. We feel that life without printed newspapers would be a diminished life. But we'd better get prepared for it. The question I'm addressing this evening is not whether the big metropolitan newspapers on newsprint have a future. Clearly they do not. I'm interested in the new digital media landscape, what it might look like, how it will be consumed, who will own it, and whether it will fulfill the critical functions of a free press. It's always darkest just before dawn. If I had been asked to give this lecture last year, my certainty about the end of print might have been controversial. But it's now just past dawn, and the shapes of the future are beginning to emerge. Not the colours as yet, but the shapes. I predict that the major metropolitan newspapers on newsprint will be largely extinct within 5 years. The good thing about long-term prediction is that embarrassment is delayed. So I'll go for it. Surely we all remember about 20 years ago when the internet first arrived, with all its amazing capabilities that for years no one could figure out how this new thing would be monetised. And look at it now. The internet is the biggest business in the world. In the same way, there is no doubt in my mind that the near future of news is almost all digital. As we all by now know, we are witnessing a revolution in the dissemination of news, a revolution no less profound than Gutenberg, a revolution that, ironically, turns Gutenberg on its head, one that completely eliminates printing. And not only that, it also eliminates distribution costs, a revolution that eliminates distance. On the face of it, this should have been the advent of a golden age for the traditional mastheads. They should surely have been well placed to continue their dominance. They owned the content. They employed the journalists. They had the readers. And there was a new technology that slashed their costs beyond imagination. But this wasn't going to be an easy gift. The changeover involved two maddening problems. The first, that today's digital advertising revenues can only provide a very small fraction of the existing print advertising revenues, and these far from cover the costs of the content of the huge newsrooms that brought you the news. And the second problem, that classified advertising, which has been a major contributor to their revenues, was cheaper and more effective online. But alas, you didn't need to be a newspaper to provide advertising space. In response to these challenges, most newspapers quickly made two key mistakes. One, they allowed upstart advertising portals to steal their classifieds, and two, they gave their news away for free. The first mistake through hubris, the second by miscalculation. If we are to believe what we read, at least one of the major newspaper houses in this country was so comfortable in the belief that the revolution in front of their noses was not going to steal their classifieds that they turned their backs on this newfangled thing. And the miscalculation? Both of the major houses had the same cunning plan, which was that they shared with most of the world's newspapers. They decided to give digital versions of their papers away for free. Their plan was to capture eyeballs, as they were then known, in the hope that they could sell advertising. They competed vigorously with each other for this traffic. Some serious mastheads pushed their online content further and further down market to where millions of these eyeballs lived. They succeeded. The traffic numbers became huge, but they overlooked a key fact. You don't need to be a newspaper to own the traffic on the internet. Search engines attracted enormous traffic, but even these were small in a vast sea of sites that the internet had become. And all these could host advertising as easily as online newspapers. And worse, Google and others introduced automatic ad serving, and online advertising became a commodity, but a commodity with an extraordinary oversupply of inventory. So, of course, ad revenues plummeted. Deep trouble. Classifieds and even display ads had migrated to the internet, and hordes of habituated newspaper readers stopped buying the daily paper and were instead reading their free versions on the net. Imagine that. What a surprise. In the US, the Wall Street Journal was the only paper to charge for its content online. Then, in 2012, The New York Times introduced paid content, and of course, it didn't take Rupert Murdoch long to gather the courage to follow suit. And this in the face of others continuing to give it away for free. Most others, with some exceptions, quickly followed. Interestingly, when Murdoch was stalking the Wall Street Journal, he famously planned to remove the pioneering paywall, but when he bought it, he saw the light and kept it. That's the potted history, and that's where we stand today. It's a strange and confused time, with most newspapers still in print but also online, with mostly half-hearted partial paywalls and readers losing their newspaper reading habits, confused by the news coming from everywhere, from Facebook, from Twitter, from Google, shared by friends, on apps, via RSS feeds, all the news aggregated from everywhere, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, the Guardian, from Sydney Morning Herald, from The Age. Oh, what a mess. What to do? Well, you don't need to be a genius to figure that despite the woes, text-based news will survive. It's incredibly easy to publish online, and a working financial model will emerge. Before teasing out the possibilities, let me put on the table that there are some positives to the disruption of the legacy newspapers. Over the next few years, it'll replace the paper-based product that was enormously expensive and therefore gave overwhelming control and political power to a very small number of huge media proprietors and organisations. I'll argue that new, very different oligopolies are emerging, and that whilst there is much to fear, there's also much to look forward to. The web dramatically drops the barriers of entry, and a great host of voices will be heard alongside the new giants. But back to the present for a moment. What are today's newspapers doing in trying to overcome their maddening problems? What's their plan? Publishers are desperately trying to extend the life of print by furiously cutting costs while searching for ways to increase their digital revenues to a point where digital will be viable. The folk at News Corp and others are still saying that it's all fine. Print is here to stay. But they know that is wrong. They just don't have a choice. They can't just ditch printers yet. The revenues of their online-only product cannot at this time pay for even a fraction of the cost of gathering and producing the news. In business school, there is a concept called harvesting. It is a strategy used by proprietors of doomed businesses to squeeze the last profits out of a dying business before allowing it to fail. Costs are cut to the bone, creating a profit from the remaining legacy revenues. I believe that most of the first world's newspapers are doing exactly this. They are harvesting. Let me repeat, it's not if, it's when the newspapers in printed form will become extinct. Not unlike the fate of film cameras or video hire stores, this will happen more suddenly than you'd expect. Circulation of printed newspapers will continue to decline slowly until all of a sudden it'll reach a tipping point, a point at which the economics of scale which now make the printing of papers possible will fall off a cliff, and the cost will simply be too high to continue. Many of the newspaper brands that now exist will disappear altogether, given the difficulty for a legacy business to reinvent itself, to in effect disrupt itself, whilst at the same time protecting the old model. As they're running their papers into the ground, they're experimenting like crazy with how to increase digital revenues. They're coming up with ideas. Native advertising, targeted advertising, and attention measurement are some of the leading ideas of the moment. Native is a big one. This new form of advertorial has been embraced by many of the world's most prestigious papers. Also known as sponsored content, it is a form of paid media where the reader's experience of the ad imitates the experience of reading the host medium. It is therefore feels like native content. The largest social platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and most others already monetize with native advertising. And newspapers are quickly following. The Wall Street Journal, the USA Today, Washington Post, The Age, The Guardian. In January this year, the New York Times ran its first native online ad. It had the New York Times emblazoned across the top of the page, and it had the look of a Times article with the headline about millennials in the workforce. This was actually an ad for Dell computers, and if you looked hard, it had the words "paid for by Dell" in 12-point above the headline. And at the bottom it said, "This page was produced by the advertising department of the New York Times in collaboration with Dell. The news and editorial staff of the Times had no role in its preparation." Since then, the Times has struck deals with 32 different brands, from Netflix to Thomson Reuters, to create ads by their in-house content studio. Other leading papers are doing exactly the same. Papers are using native ads because they're much more effective than traditional ads. Another of the big ideas is online behavioural targeting. This is the process of assembling data about users and their buying behaviour and then accurately targeting them with products and services. Most newspapers can't at this stage deliver state-of-the-art ad targeting, but they will. Necessity is a great driver. But native advertising, targeted advertising, what are they thinking? These are medicines that will surely poison them before it heals them. It seems clear to me that native advertising will diminish the trust that has always been the true value, the commercial underpinning of serious papers. The aim of native advertising is to trick the reader, to make the reader believe that an ad is not an ad, that it is objective reporting. Success here equates to the successful duping of the reader. Surely, it'll be problematic for news organisations to hold to account their brand partners, as they are known. Strangely, there appears to be no alarm bells ringing at The Guardian or the New York Times or elsewhere. Desperate measures for desperate times. And as for targeted or personalised advertising, it is just as insidious as its native sibling. Tracking user habits, following their mobile devices as they move through the physical world and assembling profiles of them can only be called surveillance. Targeting allows for invasive, ubiquitous collection of data about user behaviour. As a society, we should be almost as wary about commercial surveillance as we rightly are about government surveillance. Some level of privacy laws will inevitably be introduced to protect readers uncomfortable about being thus surveilled. But is it the case that the internet users have been so well trained to expect surveillance that most people accept it as a fact of life? And maybe native advertising doesn't bother people. I'm sure they believe that they can separate the news from the advertising. I think native and targeted advertising, problematic as they are in some form here to stay, and that they are being joined by many more online advertising innovations, some bad and some good. The Economist and the Financial Times are pushing for a system in which online ads are charged by attention minutes, based on the time readers spend on each page rather than clicks or page views. This is a tempting idea in an internet that is drowning in page views, which is in turn devastating ad rates. The experiment is still in its infancy, but has promise for serious news sites. But all of these new models will not come close to replacing the huge advertising revenues of printed papers. Despite the online advertising innovations, I believe that readers paying for content will carry a much greater burden than it did in the print era. This will bring with it many blessings. The greatest blessing will be that in order to be successful, media companies will need to offer such valuable and desirable content that people are willing to pay for it. So is this the shape of the new media? Is the shape of the new media beginning to emerge? Can we see it yet? Not really. There are still many more questions than answers. One key question is whether today's omnibus model of newspapers will survive. For well over 100 years, at the top of the food chain were the grand omnibus newspapers, the department stores of news. They had immense power, sometimes nearing those of governments. Their commercial underpinnings were based substantially on advertising, and a key attractor of big brand advertising was the prestige of a newspaper. And much of their prestige came from the level of trust they inspired. The more they held power to account, the more they were trusted. This was a perfect win-win situation. You won trust by being the protector of the people, and you made your money by being trustworthy. Some say that the big papers spent huge sums on investigative journalism as a give back, for the good fortune they found themselves in. Call me cynical, but I say that they investigated and held power to account because that was the business model. The omnibus model contains the local, the national, the international news, with opinion, with explanation, analysis, with investigations. We get the arts, culture, education, science, obituaries, and then there is lifestyle, travel, health, home and garden, real estate, cars, technology. And the two large, huge categories, sport and business. The omnibus model is now under serious challenge. It is at its best with the general news and information, but less good at the specialised, and getting worse as newsrooms shrink. People are interested in the general news, but they're more interested in themselves, in their own job, their own business, their hobby. One of the internet's great strengths is its ability to create and cater for micro-communities. It has enabled thousands of specialised sites, sports sites, business sites, property sites, health sites. The omnibus papers will lose a large portion of their old readership to this specialised media. This is already the case. People are subscribing to email newsletters in their inboxes daily, and they're eagerly opened. These represent their core interests. I receive 3 or 4 daily newsletters. I'm interested in international politics, so I have a paid subscription to Foreign Affairs, and I open the daily email as soon as it arrives. It gives me a broad summary, and if I'm interested, I click through to the longer pieces. I'm happy to pay for the rich information I receive. After reading Foreign Affairs, I rarely look at the international news in the newspapers, except for analyses by my favourite and most despised commentators. And every day I open our own Politicos to make sense of Australian politics. A close friend of mine with horse racing interests receives a daily email newsletter, the Australian and New Zealand Bloodstock News. It's long and it arrives every morning at 4 a.m. and he can't wait for it to arrive. The syndrome will surely grow in all areas of specialised hard information. People pay handsomely for business news, especially for rich, utilitarian news and data in all industries and businesses. Even general business news sites do very well. It's no wonder that the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Review have the strongest paywalls. They are selling their content. At the high value end, specialised information end, people will pay for the content, and survival is not in question. At the general news end, the news is too easy to share and disseminate. It is ubiquitous, and paywalls don't work. No one will pay for the content, and no one will pay for the advertising. The model is doomed. The old papers are trying to find a place for themselves between these two extremes, but the odds are against them. There is no doubt that they're making a valiant effort. They're trying everything, devising strategies that wouldn't have been imaginable just 2 years ago. They're lightening up, cutting costs, cutting staff numbers. They're also building new businesses on the side, like seminars and other services. They are succumbing to those new advertorials and to audience targeting. It's all understandable. I don't criticise nor envy these old warriors with all their fingers and toes in the dike holding back the tide. It's a losing battle. Take a look at the traffic on the big Australian papers. It's enormous. 3.8 million unique visitors per month to the Sydney Morning Herald, 1.9 million to the Guardian in Australia, and yet the revenue is insufficient. There is a current trend for media companies to spin off their news operations into new standalone vehicles. Time Warner cut its ties with Time magazine. Outside of Australia, News has hived off its newspapers from its profitable entertainment properties. The Tribune Company and many others in the US have done the same. Michael Wolff of USA Today, which has been separated from Gannett, refers to himself as being among the spun-off people. Given that newspapers are bleeding profusely, this trend is going to make it even harder for legacy owners to retain their foothold in the news business. Surely, if the media owners believe that their print papers can transform themselves into new viable businesses, they would support them during this transformation. But it seems that they are thinking to themselves, let's cut this tumour out before it kills the whole organisation. Let's squeeze the last value out of all these old dinosaurs before they become extinct. But so far, I've only talked about the status quo and only hinted at the new wave of international mega players. It is entirely possible that several of today's biggest papers actually survive the general meltdown by becoming truly international online players. It's possible that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian will survive the mass extinction in digital form. Their reach and credibility could certainly allow them to do this. But my feeling is that it's not going to be as neat or as benign as this. That all the transitioning strategies that I've talked about might not be enough. It might be that the best strategy is to be taken over by Jeff Bezos. Last year, Bezos, founder of Amazon, bought the Washington Post for $250 million, a fraction of its former value. Donald Graham, the then chief executive, admitted that he did not know how to save the paper. Jeff Bezos, the mega disruptor, whose unmatched ruthlessness and legendary empire building didn't buy the Post for nothing or for no reason. Might this monopolist, who many say is the destroyer of the book industry, be the saviour of newspapers? Could well be. He's developing a worldwide digital newspaper in a venture known as Project Rainbow that will include advertising but ultimately thrive on subscription revenue. Last week, he launched a new app. that offers curated news and photographs from the Post in tablet form. The app comes pre-installed in the new Kindle Fire. It will be free to millions of current Kindle Fire owners for the first 6 months, then $1 a month for the first year, and $3.99 after that. A version of the app will be available for Apple and Android next year. New Kindles are improving dramatically. The New York Times technology reviewer was breathless about the new Kindle Voyage. He wrote, "The effect is beguiling. If you look at the new Kindle for any stretch of time, you don't just forget that you're reading an e-book, you forget that you're using any kind of electronic device at all." He continues, "Amazon says that the Voyager offers a better approximation of print than has been available on an e-reader. But for me, it's far better than that. It offers the visual clarity of the printed text, while with the flexibility of an electronic device." High praise by an opposition paper. Bezos has recently been busy hiring over 100 new journalists for the Washington Post, whilst cutting pensions and other retirement benefits for current employees. The reaction has been, on balance, positive. And even David Carr, a media columnist for the New York Times, wrote, "The once embattled newspaper is in the middle of a great run, turning out the kind of reporting that journalists and readers live for." High praise again. The shapes are emerging, maybe even a bit of colour. Let's think about this. What is the Bezos model? Scale. Like the rest of Amazon, it's enormous scale. Amazon's business model depends on capturing a much bigger market than could ever have been captured by any one company before the digital era. And this enables a paid model. A very large number of people pay a very small amount to access the news. And Bezos is perfectly placed to achieve this. He has famously been a keen student of the Walmart model. And what about Facebook? They have the billions and the smarts. They might just want a little bit of what Bezos is getting. The power and the influence of owning traditional newspapers used to bring. There are whispers about that they have already begun. But their approach is very different to Amazon's, a much more indirect route to the same place, media power. Social media is playing a huge part in news site traffic. Over half of the traffic on a news site can come from social media, and about half of that from Facebook. Let me quote Felix Salmon of The Guardian 2 weeks ago. "Facebook can almost single-handedly make or break media companies. If it sends traffic, you are golden. If it takes it away, you're toast." The result is that the companies tend to treat Facebook rather as they would a fickle autocrat. There is a lot of second-guessing of what it wants, combined with a great deal of fear of what it might wake up one morning and do. And what might it do? As it provides a significant portion of the distribution channel for nearly all media, have no doubt that it will seek a share of the revenue. It will clip the ticket. But Facebook has also entered the news origination market. 7 months ago, they introduced FB Newswire, and 2 weeks ago, it launched FB TechWire, which it hopes will be the international go-to source for tech news. There will be more. We can be sure of that. And what of Google? Robert Thompson of News Corp recently lashed out, accusing it of piracy and complaining that its power increases with each passing day and that News Corp papers are unfairly compromised by Google's scale. A spokesman for the search giant initially gave a light-hearted response saying, "Phew, what a scorcher. Murdoch accuses Google of eating his hamster." But news does make some valid points. Google's size does give it dangerous monopolistic powers. News's main complaint is that Google aggregates others' original reporting. But Google's main function is traffic referral. Whilst most publishers are increasingly focusing their traffic growth on optimising their content for social media, Google remains the largest driver of traffic. And if Facebook is a fickle autocrat that has us all second-guessing, Google is God. And the ways of gods are unknowable to us mortals, so don't be too surprised if one day Google decides to become a mighty news originator itself. The digital giants are best placed to control the international news, and they'll have their local branches everywhere. We need to look no further than the Daily Mail and the Guardian to see that globalisation of the news is not a far-fetched idea. The international digital giants may well be the successors of today's big broadsheets. So, is this a tragedy? Not completely. To succeed, they will have to fulfil the important functions of the press. They will have to break the big national stories, and they'll have to keep power to account. For that is the currency of audience respect and demand, the commercial basis of the news business. And if, as I believe, their business model will be primarily a paid content model, they will need to offer very good, original product. But whilst these huge international players will be able to do some of the national news, I can't see that they'll be able to do the local. And there is a sense in which the survival of the news is the survival of the local. In the US, where the new trends seem to originate, no one has yet come up with a profitable online-only model for local news. But I believe there is a viable model. Let's imagine a local digital-only news site, and let's call it the Melbourne Voice. The Melbourne Voice will serve one city. There may be 2 or 3 such sites in that city, with varied political and social inclinations. They will be more related to the tabloid tradition, the old-style tabloid, a true voice of the people, rather than the voice of the corporation selling stuff to the people. They will be very much smaller than their omnibus ancestors, but they will still inspire trust and belonging. They will carry the stories that are important to people's lives, stories about the place we live in, about local crime, local gossip, local politics, planning, sport, business, culture, the things too local to be got from big news services, but which people want and need. The sense of community and belonging will be fostered by trusted, popular local commentators who will cover mostly local issues. But they will also comment on the national and the international news. But is this not just a little like the old model? No, it's not. It's a fraction of the size of the old omnibus papers, and it's online only, and it has no legacy baggage. But my little local, the Melbourne Voice, needs more than to just cut costs. It will need to take a leaf out of the financial press that I talked about earlier. In the same way that utilitarian and unique information is being paid for by business, the local papers will need to find something that people will pay for. Hard, relevant, essential local intelligence with a focus on local business information and detailed consumer information. Whilst I see it using a bit of the old revenue model of advertising, it will depend primarily on readers paying for scarce and desirable information. The big question is, will the new local media have the resources or the inclination to replicate the most important social functions of the legacy print papers? Will the new scaled-down digital-only versions of the giant papers have the power to hold government and big business to account? Will they be able to be democracy's effective watchdogs? Can many smaller voices still hold power to account? I say yes. Even if small, these new format news sites will be trusted and expected to fulfill this function. And their investigations will be amplified by radio, by television, and of course by social media, where outrage is the main currency. But this might not be enough, and new strategies will need to evolve to fill the critical accountability functions being vacated by legacy papers. Let's look at how the Melbourne Voice might do this. They might have a few local investigative reporters on staff, but certainly not enough to keep all the bastards honest. Some possibilities are emerging. Among these are privately funded, not-for-profit organisations like ProPublica in the US, and whistleblowers. Should organisations such as ProPublica emerge in Australia, and I say they will if they're needed, then the Melbourne Voice would compete to publish their material to its loyal audience. And whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is an extension of citizen journalism. It is driven generally by anger at corrupt and unjust acts of government and big business. Whistleblowing, of course, has legal complications, but it seems that the biggest stories, the most important exposés, come from this source. Think Chelsea Manning, think Snowden. Whilst it's easier and easier for the state to surveil its people in the digital era, digital storage is making it harder and harder for governments to keep their secrets secret. The Melbourne Voice will have a secure Dropbox to receive anonymous dirt on those in power behaving badly. In Australia, there are insufficient protections for whistleblowers and the journalists who work with them. In cases of truly egregious acts of state, the editor and proprietor might decide to take the risk and publish, and test and challenge the laws through the courts. Every democracy has its own complex set of laws pertaining to whistleblowing and the freedom of the press. Even in the US, where the First Amendment explicitly protects this freedom, it is not a perfect protection. As the media changes and downsizes, whistleblowing will be one of the means of replacing the accountability journalism lost with the whittling down of the big newsrooms. Of course, as has always been the case, journalists are needed to interpret and publicise the information brought to light by whistleblowers. The two work hand in glove. Unfortunately, as the Saturday paper noted in a recent editorial, Australia lags behind the US and Britain and many other G20 nations on whistleblower protections. There is a necessary balance between the right to privacy and the public interest in freedom of expression. There will always be a tug of war between these. Almost by definition, this is an unresolved grey zone, and the line will be drawn differently in different places. But it will always be the media's role to vigorously and continuously campaign for the public's right to know. I agree with the overwhelming voice of the Australian media that the new Section 35P of the ASIO Act, which could see journalists jailed for up to 10 years, is a repugnant and draconian law, and that it is vital that a public interest exemption is added. I hope that the Australian government has the wisdom to stand by the principles of openness and freedom and does not, out of fear or opportunism, use the current terrorist scares as a way to intimidate or stifle the press, the very source of our democracy and open society. Whilst the Melbourne Voice will include the national news, it will only do this from a parochial vantage point. I expect that online news sites, not unlike the American website Politico, will emerge to cover the national political news. They will cover national politics in detail and will also cast their eye on the main political news from the states and territories. These will be a critical piece in the nation's media mix and expect vigorous competition for top dog status, but not just yet. As paid content will need to be its economic model, it will need to wait until today's big players weaken further. And expect Bezos and his friends from Silicon Valley to be part of the Australian national news scene. I don't think we need to worry about the future of international news, but we do have to be very concerned about the threat of information monopoly. We also need our own voices, our own culture, our own point of view. If we're to be served by a branch office of Bezos, or the New York Times, or Google, or Facebook, or even News Corp, who is going to do the local accountability news? And who's going to do the local cultural news? And even the local tabloid news, the local gossip? This is not about parochialism. It's about the balance between looking inwards and looking outwards. It is about the survival of diversity. So when is he going to talk about the Saturday paper? I hear you all thinking. Where does that fit in? At the risk of being self-serving, let me describe it. It is a national newspaper, but not in the traditional mould. It sits between culture and politics, between a newspaper and a magazine, and between the past and the future. Let me explain. To understand the Saturday paper, you really need to know from where it emerged. I've been publishing books for over 40 years, and whilst at times I daydreamed of someday owning a newspaper, I never really expected to. Books are at the slowest end of publishing. Much time is spent meticulously fact-checking, editing, and designing each book. 14 years ago, the quarterly essay was born. It was located somewhere between a book and a journal. The bookish nature of the house hadn't changed, but frequency was introduced. And we were hooked. The monthly came next, now almost 10 years ago. A magazine of long-form journalism that carried the unmistakable DNA of the book publishing house that it was born of. And then came the Saturday paper. The opportunity was just too good to miss. The newspaper industry was in crisis, and there was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break in. It might have seemed illogical to publish a new newspaper when newspapers were in deep trouble. But we figured that it was in fact because of the powerless state of legacy newspapers that the right new model could succeed. We knew that people continued to value the news, that they were in fact addicted to the news, and we believed in quality over quantity and in depth over breadth. The Saturday paper emerged from a culture of books, but also the culture of daily newspapers, brought to it by its editor, Eric Jensen. Eric works under the same roof as Chris Fike, the publisher of Black Ink Books and Quarterly Essay, and under the same roof as Nick Fike, the editor of The Monthly, a zone in which the cultures of books, magazines, and newspapers meet. It is our objective, with the Saturday paper to define my broader predictions about print newspapers by creating something else entirely, a small hybrid living between magazine and newspaper, which was born in print and digital simultaneously, and which fields identical content in print and online. Just maybe we have found a way for the nostalgia of coffee and columnists with which I began this speech to beat the odds of imminent extinction. So to sum up, yes, we will lose most of the big metropolitan newspapers, and we will lose nearly all newspapers in print, and there will be many painful transitions, but we won't lose the news. For whilst the big players are becoming bigger, and many of them international giants, diversity will flourish. The low entry barriers offered by the new digital technologies will enable a host of voices to make themselves heard. Let's just hope that some of these voices will be voices we can trust. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Margaret Simons. I'm Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to thank Morry Schwartz for what I think is a courageous, because you had to be courageous to try and predict the future at this time of rapid change, but also systemic and stratified view of a likely future. I hope he's right, and I think he's probably more right than wrong. But it's now also my job to chair a brief question period. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We do have 2 roving microphones. Please do wait for the microphone to reach you, because I will remind you again that we are recording this session. Do I have a first question? Okay, the lady, Sybil, yes.
Hi, Sybil Nolan. Morry, I don't want to distract from, I'm very interested in the Saturday paper, but I noticed one absence in your speech, which I'd really like you to address, is where does the ABC fit in this vision that you're describing?
Look, it's central to this country, of course, but I decided to restrict what I was talking about today to print papers and text online. So I think that we're all very involved and engaged in what's happening with the ABC at the moment, but I'm not going to make a comment on that.
The lady at the front here.
Hi there, I'm Emma Field. I work for the Weekly Times in Victoria, so we cover regional and rural Victoria, and I'm just wondering if if there is going to be more of an element of local, but given diminishing resources, are regional and rural areas going to get the journalism they deserve, particularly like Victoria is a very small state, but the likes of the Northern Territory, Western Australia, I mean, where do you think the journalism in those areas is going to go?
I hope in versions of the Melbourne Voice, small, new, designed from the ground up, journals and publications and newspapers. I think the problem, a lot of the problem is the legacy nature of the old organisations. I think it's possible to design small local papers, online of course, that will work.
Any other questions? Other questions? Yes, back there.
What do you think of the conversation?
I think it's terrific.
Well, that was quick.
Andrew Jasper has done an amazing job, because it's not just here. He's international. It's just the most extraordinary thing. He's in South Africa, he's in Britain, he's in the US. He was one of the biggest organisations in the world. Why didn't I mention him? I don't know.
And another question, there's a gentleman, a lady, I think, in the middle of the audience here.
What do you think Warren Buffett is doing with his plans of buying or having bought those newspapers? And do you think that is an example of local voices being solidified, effectively?
Absolutely, absolutely. He was very smart. As soon as we saw him buying all those papers, small regional papers, we knew there had to be a plan there, and a good one. I think that most of them are still in print. Is that right, Eric? I think that they are, but I'm sure that his plan is to eventually take them across to online. I think it's the very example, a good example of the Melbourne voice.
Hi, Nicole Lindsay. I'm a freelance journalist. So, Morry, is the Melbourne Voice your new venture? The next one you do after the Saturday?
No, it's a hypothetical. Seriously, a hypothetical. I've registered the name. Okay.
I thought we had the voice, Glenn. Other questions? None from that side of the room? No. Okay, there's one up the back there.
Hi, thanks for talking. Michael Rodden. Does the Saturday paper make a profit, and how long would you run it for without it making a profit? And is there any room for expansion? And if so, when?
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't make a profit, but that doesn't make a terrible loss either. It's doing quite well, and I would keep it going for a long time. I think it's a valuable addition to the media landscape, and it gives me great pleasure to do it.
Barry Donovan?
Barry Donovan. Morry, that was an interesting answer about the Melbourne Voice, which you talked about quite a bit, and you obviously have thought about it. You gave one answer there that you thought it was hypothetical, but what would be the position of, having listened to what you've been saying now, if a group of concerned Melbourne people, perhaps journalists as well, came to you and said, well, look, we think Melbourne Voice, as you've explained it, is a very good thing. Would you give serious consideration to it, despite all your other involvements?
Oh, let's have a meeting.
You heard it here first. We have a question over there.
Do you think good quality long-form journalism is in danger of dying out as more and more news sources move online, where attention spans tend to be shorter?
Ironically, the opposite seems to be true. You know, even BuzzFeed is now doing long-form journalism. I'm talking about 10,000-word pieces. We find at the monthly we rated the pieces from the largest number of clicks to the lowest, and the top 10 averaged over 8,000 words. The top 10 averaged, and there was nothing in there under, I think, 7,000, and there was Rob Mann's piece on Assange at 14,500, that's number 3. There is a really great online journal that comes out of Melbourne, actually, called Aeon, A-E-O-N, and it produces only long-form journalism, and it's booming. It's booming. There are specific sites for long-form journalism. We find that the longer the piece, the better. Even in the Saturday paper, the pieces range, or average, I'd say, about 1,500 words, 1,200 words. In the top 10, the average is about 2,500 words. No, people want, that's what they want. They want serious, they don't want kind of short news that is available everywhere. They want the long-form investigation. I think it has an absolute future.
We have time for just one more question, and it will be the gentleman with his hand up there.
Maybe in opposition to that question, where do you see audio and video content going on as papers move into the online sphere?
Video content on newspaper sites? Oh, absolutely critical. I wasn't going to talk about it, but it's obvious that you go online, you can do everything. You can listen to it, you can watch it, you can read it. It's magical.
And
yeah,
audio?
I see a lot of video will happen, of course.
And audio, podcasting, that kind of thing? audio, podcasting, radio content?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All with a great future. Nothing has changed there.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. I'd like to thank Morry Schwartz again for a provocative and fascinating address. I'd like to thank all of you for turning out and attending the lecture, and wish you all good night. Please join me in thanking our speaker.